Okay, we're all set?
2022 tech, yeah. 20, or 20, what year is it? Yeah, 2022, something like that. Okay. 600. Continue, Catherine.
Great. So I gave my introduction. I'm Catherine Woodiwiss, former religion journalist, very excited to be here hosting this salon about the Bright Ages and how we understand medieval history and its resonances today. So my co-host is Donald Frederick, who is going to say hello now.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see some faces I recognize and a lot of new faces. I love medieval history. I studied in undergrad. At one point, I was thinking of going to do it for my PhD before I wound up doing neuroscience. Whole weird other story about that. But joined with the authors here, we've written a really fascinating book. If you haven't read it, definitely, I think you're going to want to read it after the salon. It challenges kind of our preconceived notions about the Dark Ages, right, of being this kind of backwards place. It's full of a lot of wonderful vignettes, kind of stories and characters that hopefully we'll be able to touch on some of that in the salon, as well as thinking about why we are all interested in history. I'm assuming everybody's here because they like history and have different reasons for thinking of history and how we use history as a lens to understand ourselves, right? And try to understand the landscape that we're in. One of my favorite quotations is from Weber, who wrote, or I guess it was, what's his name? The guy who wrote the Balinese Cockfight, talking to Weber, that we were born into a web of meaning that we ourselves did not spin, right? So we're born into this world that has these pre-existing structures, that have these histories. And the act of doing history and thinking of history allows us to come to grips and start to understand this web that we're born into, right? That this kind of topology that we inhibit. So I think it's gonna be great. I'm not gonna speak too long. I'll leave Catherine introduce our authors here, and we can get into this. So thank you.
Yeah.
Clifford Geertz. Yes, thank you, Brian. There we go. Or Brian, yeah, Matthew too. Okay.
So joining us today, we've got Matthew Gabriele, who is professor of medieval studies and the chair of the Department of Religion and Culture at Virginia Tech. He has writings all over the internet. And David and Perry, who is former professor of medieval history at Dominican University. And today he is a journalist, public historian, and speaker. So welcome both. And we're excited to dig into the book and all of its resonances. But to start off, I just want to ask a quick question to kind of orient us to you and you to us, and that is, what brought both of you to study medieval history?
Do you want to jump on? Go ahead, David, or do you want me to go?
Yeah, I'll go. And I remember it very clearly. I was a sophomore in college at Wesleyan University, and I was taking a medieval history class just to take it. And we were supposed to write a final paper, and I was interested in early English kingship, and I was reading these early English chronicles, or actually annals, which is a different kind of text written by monks. And there was a genealogy of the kings, and it went back to Odin, and I thought that was pretty cool, or Wotan. And then about 200 years later, 100 years later, in the same text, there's a genealogy of a different king, and it went back to Odin, and then it kept going back to Adam, as in Adam and Eve. And I thought, that's amazing. I mean, I remember sitting in the library and just thinking, that's amazing. I want to think about that a lot. And so I wrote a paper, and I'm still writing papers and thinking about it a lot. But that was really the moment when I thought, this medieval history thing, that's cool. I want to understand this. And the reason I like that story is that it's just, for me, about reading primary texts in translation, right? In editions, there's still a lot of distance, but just reading primary texts and trying to think really hard about them and what we can know about the people who wrote them and the world that they were in. And that really is still my project.
And for me, I mean, I took a little bit of a different route. And, you know, Donald, I don't want you to feel bad about studying neuroscience instead of the Middle Ages. I mean, we all make terrible decisions in our lives. And but for me, like, as an undergraduate, I went to the University of Delaware. I was undecided. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I spent a semester, like my first semester, as an anthropology major, and took a bunch of anthropology courses and decided very quickly that was not what I wanted to do. And so decided to take a gen ed course. One of them was on the Middle Ages. I thought, like, I know what knights are. Sure, let's do that. We'll get this history thing out of the way. And I fell in love with the professor, that I just wanted to take every course that he taught.
Not in any unfortunate way.
Not like that way. No. I guess you do have to clarify sometimes with things that are going on in academia. So intellectually fell in love with the professor. I just wanted to take every course that he taught. The thing that struck me was he was the first faculty member, the first teacher that I had that really took his students seriously. Listened to their questions, thought about them, and helped them kind of bring them along in the construction of knowledge. And so by the end of that's my undergraduate degree, I knew a lot about medieval history, and I figured like I like this stuff. I want to continue to do it, and so I kind of stumbled into it more than anything else.
Awesome. So the book, Bright Ages, which I know some of you have read, a few of you bought specifically for the purpose of this salon, which is awesome. And hopefully all of us, yeah, that's great. Maria has one right there. And hopefully all of us will buy and read it at some point. But the book itself is examining basically misunderstandings and misconceptions of the Middle Ages, and specifically refuting kind of the stereotype of the Dark Ages, which I think all of us know to some extent is the Dark Ages is a myth. Dark Ages is a construct, but the degree to which you two kind of detail actually all of the different currents that are going on that sort of make this an unfair name is really interesting. I wanted to give one example, and this actually occurs later in the book. And this is when in the 1550s, Spain is sort of, I think you say, deciding what Native Americans were. There's a fight between landowners who draw on Aristotelian and classical ethics that sort of any other people are barbarians that are open to rule, and a Dominican friar who is drawing much more on the religious medieval concept of convivienza or coexistence, which was part of Spain from 1800 to 1492, which is basically the period we're talking about here, that people sort of dismiss as the Dark Ages. And interestingly, what the tension that's illuminated here is that religious medieval thought was in fact the one sort of preaching tolerance, and antiquity humanism actually was not, which I think is not really the narrative that we think about when we think about sort of medieval times being the sort of dark period of religious violence, and classical antiquity being much more enlightened humanism. So I'm curious, with just that example of tension, what drew you to calling this book The Bright Ages, and what were you hoping to illuminate by doing that?
Yeah, I'll start, and then David can kind of jump in. So the primary metaphor I think that we're trying to get across with the Bright Ages is the brightness of it is one of illumination, meaning that we can see better. So we're not trying in any way, shape, or form to say that the European Middle Ages were some great period, that this myth of the Dark Ages cast the period as one of only barbarity, and yeah, there were good things that happened, and so we're trying to recuperate it in that way. Like, we're not just trying to swing the pendulum in the other direction, we're just trying to show that the past is ultimately messy, that it's full of human beings who make decisions. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, but because they're human beings, they're complicated creatures, and we need to see both sides of that. As far as the title itself, there's a really I think it's a nice anecdote, because it's actually a true anecdote about how we actually decided to write the book. In that David and I had known each other for a long time. We were both medievalists. And early in 2019, I was in England, I was in London for a conference, and I went to the British Library, which was doing a phenomenal exhibition on early medieval kingdoms called Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And I went through the exhibition. It was filled with kind of gold and illuminated manuscripts with vibrant colors, and the text there was explaining like where these material objects came from. And it really demonstrated that even in this kind of the central period of the Dark Ages, really kind of the northwest part of Europe, far removed from the Mediterranean, that they were in constant contact with those places, both through trade, but also with people and ideas moving back and forth. Certainly not as fast as they do today, or even as they maybe had done at the height of the Roman Empire 600 or 700 years before. But anyway, but still in constant contact. And then as these things do, as these exhibitions do, they kind of shuffle you into the gift shop at the end. and I was looking around, for a little tchotchke to buy or something like that. And I went to the, the book section, and the stuff on early medieval England that was there specifically tied to the exhibition was phenomenal. It was excellent contemporary scholarship, really, again, emphasizing the themes of the exhibition itself. But the general histories of the Middle Ages were very different. They were still trafficking in this idea of a closed off, superstitious, materially unsophisticated period that was just kind of outside of the rest of the world. That was kind of, again, this idea of the Dark Ages. It simply didn't match what I had just seen and what the exhibition was trying to get across. And so I remember standing there vividly in the gift shop. I pulled out my phone, I texted David, and I said, David, we're going to write a history of the European Middle Ages. And he must have been awake or something like that at the time back in Minnesota where he is. And because he texted back almost immediately and said,
we're going to call it the Bright Ages. It was right in that moment. The Dark Ages try to yank this 1,000-year period of European history out of time, right? Out of a story of progress, I guess, in particular. And we've seen that a lot in the reaction to the book from economic historians who want to have kind of the origins of the human species to Rome, and then a drop, and then we get to the Renaissance, and then we get a rise to today when everything is there's lots of progress, right? I was tracing a chart in in the air, if you couldn't tell what I was doing, because they often have charts. There's one particular critic who has a chart of the GDP of the planet at like negative 48,000 BCE, which is not a serious calculation. I mean, he's making it seriously, but it is not something you can actually do in a serious way. It's a meaningless thing. But he's got these charts, right? And so the Dark Ages is this idea that yanks that yanks 1,000 years out of time or out of a linear narrative of progress, and it's just wrong. And then the Dark Ages also says, we can't see, and that too is just wrong. That we can see, and it's complicated and does work, but it's not in some ways more complicated than trying than the work of history, which is always working with the available sources and trying to wrestle with them and figure out where they come from. There is no era in history that is simply transparent that we can just look at and say, oh, that's exactly what was happening. There's always work to do with history. And so we're really trying to emphasize kind of this knowability. And so that's why we finished the book in part with that anecdote that you just talked about, but also, I mean, it illustrates the flip side, which is that modernity is not, that there are no golden ages, that progress is not a linear, simple thing, that, today, right now, we're in this era of mechanized warfare. And I just saw a headline in The Guardian talking about Putin as exacting medieval violence on civilian populations. And I mean, all war is bad for civilian populations. Some wars are worse. Some leaders use more violence against civilians than others. That is something we could all open up our Thucydides and talk about that, and before. But certainly what Putin is doing with these missiles, and also what's happening on the internet with it's as modern a story as you can get. And we cannot understand it by calling it medieval. There are political reasons, perhaps, why it is useful for people to call Putin medieval. And I'm sympathetic to them, but I also think in fact it is counterproductive and wrong to do so. So when we're talking about brightness, right, and we're talking about progress and modernity and all these things, we're really trying to push back against a pretty central way of thinking about time that distorts.
Yeah, just to emphasize too, another thing that the Dark Ages does, or at least pushing back against this idea of the Dark Ages, and again, kind of showing how complicated it is it disrupts, as David was saying, this idea of linearity. And like back to that anecdote, the debate that we talked about at the very end of the book between De las Casas and Sepulveda in 1550, it happens at a university, a medieval invention in the city of Valladolid in Iberia, which didn't really exist until as a distinct thing until the Middle Ages, dealing with peoples who live across the Atlantic, which hadn't been conceptualized, like was literally outside of the mental world of medieval Europeans. But what's so fascinating about it is, and we don't really talk about it, is that the outcome is so messy and contingent too, in which the medieval religious ideas, as you said, kind of win at the beginning, and the Spanish crown kind of changes their transatlantic policy because of it. But then at the same time, then Sepulveda, the modern humanist who's arguing effectively for genocide, like kind of wins in the end because the crown changes policy, because people react to them. But it could have turned on a dime. And so, it was very easy to envision, and in fact, probably people at the time did envision an outcome that was very different than what we ended up with, or looking back on 500 years later. I see Brian had a question in the, sorry, I don't mean to jump in. Brian had a question in the chat. I have no idea. I hadn't heard about the astrological connection, so I would be curious to hear more about that.
And then Maria, do you have, let's see, a raised hand?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I just want to fangirl a little bit. I love this book so much.
Thank you.
Just tremendously exciting. And I was actually in Ravenna a couple of months ago. And we're with one of my sisters, and we were like the last people alive. We felt like we're there. That sounds really dark. I don't mean it that way, but it was incredible to just be in, you open the book with the Gala, Placidia's little church. And anyway, it was amazing. What I wanted to ask you was, could you sort of open the book with the various sacks of Rome and then the move to Constantinople, and you kind of make the point that Edward Gibbon's whole idea and the way we sort of think of that period is to say that, all of the lovely, the beauty of Rome, the honor and glory and all of that sort of went away, and it was all got really disorganized and everything was horrible for 1,000 years. And I just love the way you just talk about how this center of political power moved and culture moved, but like it didn't end. So I just would love to hear a bit, more of you talking about that, really.
I mean, the Dark Ages and the fall of Rome are kind of two phrases that are linked. And I'm actually arguing in some ways, since the book came out, even more strongly that you can't use either of them. And what I mean by you can't is that if you use them, you can't exempt them from their history. So you cannot say fall of Rome but not the way Gibbon meant. Like you're trapped in Gibbon's center of gravity. You can't say the Dark Ages and then say, but not the bad Dark Ages. I just mean this, like you're stuck in this black hole, right? You're stuck in this gravity well that dates back to Petrarch and continues for 600 years since then. That these phrases exist in a history, and that I recommend just not using them. So on the fall of Rome, right? There is at least one Roman Empire, really clear Roman Empire, and often quite a few pretty credible Roman empires throughout every minute of our book. Every page of our book, there is at least the empire in Constantinople, which is the Roman Empire. So if you say Rome fell, then I say, well, what about Constantinople? You say, well, not that Rome, right? We start to get in the no true Scotsman fallacy, where, that any Rome that exists is not the true Rome that you meant when you say fall of Rome. So, but then, we have centers of power in Rome itself from very early on with the papacy. And then we have Charlemagne, and I'm a Venetianist, so there's a period of time in which Venice is making a really strong argument, and in fact, centering their whole political kind of iconography around being the lord of, it's 1/4 and 1/2 of 1/4, because there's contracts involved, of the Roman Empire. And they have this very specific kind of legalistic phrase that they're making these arguments about. And we can weigh some arguments more heavily than others, but throughout the entire Middle Ages, there are things that are credibly claiming to be the Roman Empire or placing themselves in this lineage one way or another. So given that, right from the start, as with this title, The Bright Ages, we wanted to figure out how to engage that center of gravity. And for us, it was Galla Placidia. And in particular, this act of creation, not by her, but perhaps at her urging in this church, this act of beauty that merges ancient and contemporary artistic and religious and cultural norms together, which is, say, it's a pagan and a Christian space in really important ways, just sort of from its structure and style. And a woman So not one of these generals or male emperors. That wasn't an accident. And someone whose life spanned the whole region, and who later in her life is writing letters to the emperor in Constantinople, well after Rome fell. If you want to talk about the sack of Rome in 410, which she was at and taken as kind of a political prisoner of war, and married off to a Visigoth. So she was there. It wasn't like she missed it. But she's writing letters to the emperor in Constantinople saying, hey guys, you're doing Christianity wrong. All serious people listen to the Pope. And Rome is still the center of the world in kind of in 450. So she's writing this down. And from her perspective, which is as valid as any other perspective, right? Things are continuing as they go. So we're really trying to think about how to pull us out of that story of collapse. And then having gotten out of that, we can say things like, yes, the legions left areas and didn't come back. Nobody knew they weren't coming back, right? When they see the soldiers march away, it doesn't mean that they know, oh, well, I guess that's the fall of the Roman Empire. But it is true that they march out of Britain and they don't return. It is true that the power structures change. It is true that economic conditions shift away from certain kinds of long distance trade. It is true that many cities grow smaller, though in other places cities are growing bigger, right? All these things are still true, and we can talk about it in ways that I think make at least an effort to escape that center of gravity of the older story.
I think you see that in the scholarship of the medieval world, kind of generally like stuff that's being published in academic presses and in journal articles, scholarly journals and things like that, is that they are moving very distinct. There's a cadre of people who are still very much arguing for fall, decline, and things like that. But the wider scholarly community seems to be moving more towards the terms of transformation, because transformation is a value neutral term. Things were like this, and then they were like that. Like, it doesn't assign like a good or bad, but a fall suggests that there's something lamentable about what's happening there. And Gibbon was very explicitly kind of doing that. I mean, like, he wanted to convey that something was really lost and transformed. Donald made a point in the chat too, and it absolutely had something to do with kind of 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th century Protestantism and Catholicism in the historiography of those periods, in which they were trying to assign Catholicism into the medieval period as a deviation from the original Christianity, and a superstition that we kind of climbed out of with the, according to them, with the Reformation. So again, ascent, decline, and then reascent as well. So again, but the scholarship, and again, what we're trying to say is we're not trying to say anything that before in the 4th century things were the exact same as they were in the 7th century. They were quite different, but that's also 300 years, and it's not too much to say that here's why things are different then or now than they were then.
Oh yeah, and things were very different in 50 BC with the Republic into 300 AD to the Empire, right?
Or even 100 CE with the Empire to the Empire in 400, right? I mean, like
exactly.
You don't get 300 years without significant transformation under any time, place, rubric. I mean, just like that. That's not how humanity works.
Yeah, in some ways, there's this very idealized, Augustinian, golden age of the early AD, right? Period that is projected over all of the Roman Empire period, and brushed aside how many empires or emperors in 1 year, right? And
and I this is again something I've been saying we don't say in the book, but that I've been saying a lot since the book came out, which is I want people to be just as skeptical of golden age narratives as dark age narratives. That golden age is for whom? Where is the labor coming from? What is the status of unfree people in 50 CE or even 150 CE during the Roman Golden Age? Or I was just talking about this with another scholar, the huge slave economy during the Abbasid Golden Age, in which great stuff's happening. I mean, in terms of the literary and cultural artistic production in Baghdad, it's amazing at that moment, and that's why it's called the Golden Age. But there's a slave economy we need to look at, and that's true with so Golden Age is for whom?
I think that's a super fascinating point that there's so much of the speaker and the modern kind of power politics when we think back and trying to have some sort of sense of legitimacy. I find it fascinating that even to today, we still look for some sort of genealogy, going back to how you first fell in love with the medievals, of our own genealogy, right, in the US, right? Like we very distinctly try to project Washington as the new Rome, everything from the, the Capitol and the architecture, right, to the various, Latin phrases we use with it, that we see, or it's sort of the narrative that Rome moves, right? So you begin with Ravenna, moves up to Aachen, over to London or Paris, right? Or whoever's trying to claim, or to the east to Constantinople, right? That this source of power, but everyone's trying to go back to claim some sort of legitimacy from Rome. I think even like kind of modern European EU projects and stuff as well, right? So a question I have, do you think we will ever come to a point where we stop trying to claim Rome as a predecessor?
Yeah, that's an easy one. I'll take it. No.
Okay.
No, I think, it's really interesting, the US kind of Rome comparisons, for example, because you see that kind of all the time. Our colleague Sarah Bond, who teaches at the University of Iowa, like has some really fantastic kind of public-facing scholarly articles on places like Hyperallergic and Washington Post and places like that, in which he kind of catalogs like all the ways that Rome has been, the US has been compared to Rome. Oftentimes, again, like with this narrative of fall, right? That we're in the twilight of US empire. I'm going to put quotes around that. Twilight of US empire, because, and then so we're going to look back to this period of the fall of Rome, this transition to the Dark Ages. I think that's a current that's underlying contemporary comparisons of the COVID-19 pandemic with the Black Death, right? Is that there's a great kind of period of darkness that we're undergoing, political, cultural, social, economic, whatever, and then we're moving into something that will be barbaric. Most post-apocalyptic fiction that's being written nowadays, right, is positing some sort of collapse of American civilization, which leads to a new Dark Ages. And you can tell it's the new Dark Ages because like they're all really dirty when they're pictured, and they're living in like thatched huts and things like that. So they're using that aesthetic. But anyway, so back to your original question about will we stop looking to Rome? No, and I think part of that is because of, at least in Europe and the United States, Rome occupies such an outsized and conscious connection to the formation of the idea of the nation state as a whole, right? Like, I've done some public writing, like for Forbes, for example. One of my most read pieces was about there were no borders in the Middle Ages, and like the idea of the nation state is an extraordinarily modern thing. Like it is really an 18th, 19th century construction, but its legitimacy, because they kind of knew it was novel, they needed something ancient in order to justify the formation of these states. And so they looked back to a model of Rome, but then kind of filtered through the breakup of Rome into its constituent parts. So that's why you have, instead of kind of a pan-European empire, which Rome kind of was, right? You have Gaul, which becomes France, and then Germania, which becomes Germany. England becomes its own thing. Iberia becomes, Spain and Portugal. Portugal has a real problem in the Middle Ages justifying its existence because it is totally brand new and they just like literally invented it. But good for them. Portugal's great. But I mean, all nation states are invented, so it doesn't matter. But anyway, but they needed that nugget of antiquity in order to justify their experiences. And so even throughout, like as late as, well, not as late as, but even throughout the French Revolution, right, is that one of the lines of argument about whether we keep the monarchy, the revolutionaries were arguing whether we keep the monarchy, whether we transform the monarchy, whether we get rid of the monarchy, was based upon understandings of Roman history, right? Like invocations of both the triumph of the Caesars and Augustus and the rise to prominence, but also Brutus as a model as well, like trying to end dictator tyranny as they kind of thought about it. So I think it just has, it's like trying to imagine something after capitalism. Like it's really hard to think outside of a totalizing system. Rome in some ways historically is a totalizing system. So
there are a lot of great thoughts and questions in the chat. So does anyone want to jump in and offer thoughts or questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple, following up.
Sure.
interesting.
Okay, there we go. I mean, speaking of not getting away from it, right? Like Senator Graham 2 days ago called for, a Brutus There's no coincidence that the czar comes from Caesar, right? And speaking of Caesar, who was it, like Victor David Hansen, something like that, right? Like one of these, like, has explicitly called for a new Caesarian transition of the US, right? So I you know, these history, to use your words, is echoing very strongly recently. But I think we had some questions or bring some more people into the discussion.
I mean, I was thinking about that Lindsey Graham comment. And I thought it was really, really quite, I mean, it's quite telling that sort of that's one of the interesting things about Caesar, which is a little outside our period, is the way in which the early empire, particularly once it sort of settles in a little bit, is the model of the golden age, right? But also the overthrow of the tyrant. So Caesar is both the tyrant to be overthrown and kind of the founding creator genius, right? So he occupies this double role depending on what's convenient for the speaker. And in this case, for Lindsey Graham, suddenly instead of imperial Rome being the model, imperial Rome is the enemy to be thrown over, because that's the more useful model for him. Anyway, there's some hands up, and I'd love to.
Yeah, the analogies or whatever are useful for the politics, I guess. Ken, I guess. And when we go through questions, you can just say your name and where you're from. Like, we're always interested to see where everyone's from here. So.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Just picked up the book, so it's my junior high nightmare come to life that I've shown up to class and haven't done the reading, but it was bound to happen.
Do you have pants on at least? Sorry.
I'm going to take the fifth on that, but pants affirmative. But what I would like to specifically ask is, obviously the Crusades have a huge part in European history of what we identify as the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages, certainly. What part would you say that those play in European history in regards to most of what you're discussing? And I have a special interest in the Third Crusade and its effect on Britain. I'm wondering if you can speak to that, both the political and religious ramifications. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, the Crusades. So David and I both started our careers like as medievalists, like writing on the Crusades, or I should say, actually kind of Crusades adjacent topics. And what I mean by that is that, David's wonderful first book is about kind of relics trade, but deals directly with the Fourth Crusade, in which Venetians and Europeans take the city of Constantinople. My first book dealt with kind of the origins of the First Crusade, though I do talk about the First Crusade itself. But these ideas of holy war and kind of where they came from in the Christian West, and how nostalgia and golden ages kind of play into it. As it relates to the Bright Ages, though, is that I think you see it kind of threaded through. Not the Crusades themselves, but this idea of holy war, which is not kind of an invention of the 11th and 12th centuries, but is kind of there, at least in nascent form in various ways from the very beginnings of what scholars of religion now call kind of the Jesus movement, early Christianity, and then medieval Europe as well. We do have a couple chapters that focus specifically on that, because I think we think, sorry, just to speak for David as well, we think very strongly that the taking of Jerusalem that happens in 1099, the quote unquote success of the First Crusade, what's called the First Crusade, is transformational in the way that Europe interacts and thinks about the rest of the world. In part for political and cultural reasons, because they establish not colonies necessarily, but functional states in the in the Middle East around certain cities, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the county of Antioch and Acre and places like that, Beirut, Tripoli, anyway, etc. It forces them to interact in a different type of way with the Byzantine Empire, the Latin West, but it also because it was an unexpected success, and I have to emphasize that, and it's very, very clear from the sources themselves, that they wanted to retake Jerusalem, they wanted to protect it from an imagined enemy. They had, it's very unclear if they knew what a Muslim was in at least among the many of the participants, but from an imagined enemy, they wanted to retake it, they wanted to reclaim it for Christianity, and they did. Like, they knew about how far they had to literally walk, from Paris to Jerusalem. They knew about the enemies that they would encounter. They faced numerous defeats along the way, and yet at the end, they end up taking the city and establishing this presence. So there's the First Crusade creates an explosion of historical writing in Europe that hadn't been seen for literally 1,000 years. There are more kind of contemporary or near contemporary accounts of the First Crusade than almost any other event until you get into the very late Middle Ages, texts written in Latin, because they're trying to explain why it matters, what it matters, and there was no agreement on that. It was something momentous. It was fitting within God's plan, because that was really the only way that they could explain it. Excuse me. And it meant something important for kind of the place of the Latin Christians in God's plan. And this might mean further conquests the elimination of the Muslim enemy. It might mean further attempts to persecute the Jews who were living in Europe at the time. It might mean expansion of territorial frontiers, just kind of depending on the sources. By the time you get to the Third Crusade, and we deal with this just a little bit in the book, that's responding to another moment of crisis, because after this momentous conquest of Jerusalem, the taking of Jerusalem, they've lost the city again to Saladin in 1187. And so Gregory the Eighth, I think it was, Pope Gregory the Eighth, issues this papal bull, Audita Tremendi, the earth, listen and hear and let the earth tremble, in which it's basically it's the West freaking out, because they were beginning to be so clear about the path that history was going to take, and then it's totally upended. Saladin comes in, and so they have to respond. And so that's why you see a momentous response that you do. The King of France goes, the King of England goes, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa goes. He drowns very quickly in Turkey, unfortunately, falls down and face first in a river. It happens, I guess. And then they don't end up taking Jerusalem, and then so they have to kind of reconceptualize their whole world, and this leads to follow-on effects, like you were mentioning about impact on England. Richard is gone for the vast majority of his reign. John, his brother, takes over. There's pressure from Philip Augustus, who's the King of France. He races home once he sees that Richard is actually gone, to attack Richard's lands in France while Richard is away, and so it has all these kind of follow-on effects. One of the greatest massacres of the Jews related to the Crusades happens in England as they're collecting taxes for Richard to go on crusade. So this stuff is kind of woven through, because it deals with, again, this messiness and contingency. What if Richard didn't go? What if Jerusalem didn't fall? We want to ask those types of questions, not to offer kind of counter narratives, but to simply say, it could have been different, and we should think about that.
This talk about Crusades, which I think was also sort of a belated invention as a term, at least in English, occurred much later. And we've talked about terminology being really important. Dark Ages, I think it was Petrarch sort of coined the term or popularized the idea of Europe emerging out of this Dark Ages. But then even the idea of Renaissance is a little bit artificial as well, sort of
not just a little bit.
Entirely artificial. centered on Venice, right? It was sort of a very, I think
more Florence, but yeah.
I think you called it at some point a spectacularly successful PR campaign. So a question I have for you guys, but for the group as a whole, are all of the ages that we think about in history just PR campaigns? How do we think about is there a historically true and accurate way to call certain periods in history, or is it just a matter of whose PR campaign has won?
Well, let me start there. I'd be happy to. I'd love to hear other thoughts, but I'm going to start there. And the answer is they're not all PR campaigns. They are all artificial. And one of the things that's interesting to me about the Renaissance is that we can see it being created as a new period of history in real time. in the 14th and 15th century. And that's actually pretty unusual, right? That, nobody said, oh, we're living after the Roman Golden Age, right? Nobody said you're living after the fall. Well, I mean, like these ways in which historians carve up time is often done centuries later, if not millennia later, right? And we do it for different kinds of reasons, and I'll talk about that in a minute. What's interesting to me about the Italian Renaissance is that Petrarch is trying to make it happen in his lifetime, explicitly in his letters. And most of you, if you know Petrarch, probably know him through his Italian poetry, which is beautiful. He is the most annoying Latinist I've ever worked with, because he's trying to show off Latin tricks. So he's like, oh, Tacitus used this really weird structure, I'm going to do that. And Cicero used this other one, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to do them on top of each other. So I can just say that part of my intense dislike for Petrarch was spending a semester in graduate school translating his Latin and hating it. I love Cicero, I love Tacitus, I enjoyed the puzzle of the Latin. So I have a little antipathy to Petrarch that's not fair. But at the same time, it is fair because he's trying to do this kind of work saying there was this Dark Ages and now there's me and people like me, and it's a new period in history. And what's so extraordinary about the Italian Renaissance is that that argument works, and it has stuck with us in ways that there are lots of people in that. And I mean, it really, in some ways, Matt's scholarship, you could talk about more medieval people who are trying to work with it. Certainly anyone in the Middle Ages who is trying to figure out where we are in Christian time, which is to say in relationship to the apocalypse, right, to Revelation, right? People throughout the Middle Ages are trying to figure out where they are in time. And so there's lots of arguments about sort of periodization in our frame of reference, but most of them don't work. They don't stick with historians, whereas the Renaissance is then reported as fact, in part because we have really pretty pieces of art that show up that we like. And so that gives us kind of something to stick time onto. And just one other kind of only slightly related thought, part of the way we talk about time today in the 21st century, and really from the 19th to 21st century, is because of the way like academic jobs work and academic courses work and or book periodization works, right? Like which is totally not intellectual and not particularly interesting in some ways, but there are early modernists and they get hired for different jobs than modernists or medievalists. And so in some ways, these time periods have become locked, or you take classes in which, well, we got to teach Western civilization, which is a problematic term, but we can't teach all of it in one semester. So we'll stop at 1500 and then start the next one. This is true in US history too, whether we talk about kind of antebellum US, and if we stop right before the Civil War or right after the Civil War, that too, like some of it is just because the US history survey is a 2-semester process. So we have to have we have to put a break in, and then over decades or even longer, we start to think those breaks mean something rather than we've just reached Christmas and everyone goes home for 3 weeks and then we start again in the spring. And so I mean, I think it's worth thinking about the ways in which historians, which is to say me and Matt, or anyone in these kinds of disciplines, not just in history departments doing this sort of work, are absolutely complicit in these artificial moments of time, because we have to figure out who we're going to hire or what we're going to study in grad school or what we're going to put on our syllabus in really mundane but over the generations powerful sorts of ways.
Can I ask a question about that then? So back in the midst of time, I also studied medieval history as an undergrad, and I work in technology now. And those things are thoroughly related to each other. But one of the things I'm vaguely dredging up from my memory was that Petrarch and various people were very sort of self-consciously aware of, we are doing something very new and different here, because lots of classical texts that were not available to us for many centuries have suddenly become, come back into circulation, and we can do Greek, particularly Greek, Greek and Roman texts better than scholars have been able to do for several centuries. And we've got all of these new fantastic classical ideas, and they're changing everything, how we work and what we do. And was it vaguely to do with the fall of Constantinople and documents coming their way? Anyway, I can't remember that. It's just sort of vaguely. So, but it's to say, like, is there? Yes, there's for various artificial reasons we chop things up into eras, but people at a certain moment do seem to have been quite self-consciously self-creating a new era that was distinct from what they felt had gone previously. And was it to do with documents or not? And was it real or not?
And it's a good big question. They definitely were making the argument they were doing something new. To the extent that they were doing something new is the question of debate. And you can tell different stories. Everything that Petrarch was doing, everything that the people like Bruni in Florence were doing, everything that the great Renaissance visual artists were doing, you can find connections in. They were doing it because of things that were happening in the Middle Ages. They were doing it because of things happening in universities that were fundamentally medieval, right? They were finding texts that had been preserved on purpose by medieval monks, even if they were reading them in different ways, right? The texts did not sit, by and large, buried, in a locked tomb of the emperors that no one had touched for 1,000 years. They were right there in medieval monasteries, having been copied in medieval monasteries. There were absolutely medieval people who read Greek, and I know this because I'm a Venetianist, and a lot of them read Greek because they certainly spoke Greek. They were deeply connected to the Greek world the whole time. It's also true that new texts did come out of Constantinople in the later 15th century, right? So this is long post Petrarch. He's quite dead, but that there are definitely and people coming as well, and the fall of Constantinople in 1453, by which point the Italian Renaissance, to whatever extent it is, has been happening for 70 or 80 years, right? So it definitely creates an opportunity and a need for new kinds of storytelling about time and new kinds of storytelling about the world, particularly for Christians. And so there are new stories that are being told. Some of them remind me a lot of the news stories that are told in 1204 after the fall of Constantinople to the Crusade. But those stories only last for about a year before it all, this new empire they think they're building starts to fall apart almost immediately. So there's this amazing moment in 1204 where the news comes back to the Pope in particular, but also to Venice and to other places that Constantinople has fallen to these crusaders, and it's great. And they start to write new stories. And then they find out, oh, wait, no, there's now 4 different Roman emperors and an invasion by the Bulgarians, and, nothing good is happening. And so they have to tell different stories. So, I mean, I think, then there are people who are finding new texts that haven't really been talked about and are thinking deeply about them and are doing a kind of intentional identity. I mean, Petrarch is doing a kind of intentional identity formation that is very different, but it's made possible by the things that have been happening, in the world of Dante, which I would say, that he's only able to do these things because of the medieval world that he's trying to reject. So it's messy. It's messy in that way.
Yeah, thanks.
I think this is another, just very briefly, this is another moment like we were talking about earlier where transformation is, I think, a better way to conceptualize it, is that, you can look at, like David was saying, like Giotto and Michelangelo, like they're different, they're very different, but like you can see lines, right? Like what Dante did with the Paradiso, which we talk about kind of at the end of the book, like, yeah, it looks forward in some ways to, the literary production of the centuries after that, but like, it's a really medieval text in a lot of ways with connections to romances that were produced centuries beforehand. So again, we're not trying to say in any way that like things aren't different, but the idea of kind of a sharp break was a conscious construction of Petrarch and his ilk, but it's a lot more complicated than that and a lot more fluid, I think, than they tried to make it out.
So Anna, I saw a hand from you, and then I'd love to hear from anyone else who hasn't spoken yet, if anyone else wants to jump in.
Hi, yeah, I have so many thoughts. I suddenly recalled my favorite part of The English Patient by Ondaccia, where the Allied forces are trying to take back Italy, and they are advancing northward, and they encounter all these little kind of fortress towns on top of little rocks, and so they have to fly in the medievalists from Oxford because they have no idea what they're dealing with. And I think there's this line in the book that some of the professors have not really accepted the existence of airplanes on which they were flown in. I definitely when I think of history as an Eastern European, with past defined by the Holocaust and the fall of the Berlin Wall and all these like breakthrough events, I do tend to see, history as like demarcated by these very stark lines. And I do think about the Middle Ages in similar terms. So like whether it's Constantinople or the Alhambra Decree or dispatching Columbus, these are kind of breakthrough events. But what really strikes me about it is that we, like, just kind of in my own cultural consciousness, we've had recent events that seem to be just as much breakthroughs, but we haven't really assigned an era term to them. Like, I'm pretty sure that in 200 years, people will look back at walking on the moon in 1969, and that's going to be like a big deal. Whereas for us, it's just like an event in our like unstoppable technological progress. One of the things that really scares me about history is that we always talk about eras like pre-something. So we are pre-something as well, but we don't know what. But you kind of know that in 50 years, they will talk about you like all the people who had no idea X, Y, Z were coming. And yeah, I keep thinking what we're the pre of, because pre-Second World War, people had no idea. Like they didn't call the First World War the First World War. They thought like that was it. So I try to sometimes look at events looming on the horizon and try to kind of like infer like what will I be the pre of? If you have any tips on that, any speculation?
Well, I got to tell you, I think about it all the time. I'm a completely failed science fiction and fantasy writer, which is say I've written some.
Me too.
I haven't published any. I mean, I've sold exactly zero things. Although Ada Palmer, who we mentioned, did commission a story and paid me for it, but then it didn't get published because the collection fell through. So that, I mean, I'm totally a failure. I want to be very clear that I'm a failure at speculative fiction. And I'm only confident in that because I can hold this book in my hand, as, to say I'm not, right? But I've been thinking, I've been trying to think about in my fiction now from the lens of a medieval historian. What does it look like 1,000 years from now? And the ways in which, William Randolph Hearst in the late 19th, early 20th century and Donald Trump are very similar figures. And to think about the ways in which there are two wars between a guy named George Bush and Saddam Hussein, and how confusing that will be to history students, right? Bush 1, Bush 2, but not any more confusing than Edward the First, Second, and Third or all the Henrys, right? I mean, this is something that as a medievalist we know. Another
Those
line I
like
like.
Big questions that teachers
right.
will like use against students they don't like.
I mean, I study the Fourth Crusade, right? There are 3 emperors named Alexios within about 12 months of each other. It's just not right. It's and often in the Latin they'll say like Alexius, the son of Alexius, was killed by Alexius, who did and like you have to build flowcharts, right? So and another thing I like to say is nobody in the 1370s thought they were in the middle of the 100 Years' War, right? Like that is not just so I try to think about modernity because I'm also a political writer, like my last piece that I had published was about Medicaid policy. So I mean, I'm really not just as a pundit, not just as a, but I mean, I wrote a piece of reported policy journalism on Medicaid. So I think I try to engage it with humility. I do think that's a lot easier to sell that humility, unfortunately, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, where all of our modernity and science and knowledge and things that we can do to fight disease have encountered humanity and encountered the complexity of viral evolution, and has put us in the world we're in, however you want to kind of look at it. And I don't know that we want to derail into a debate about COVID policy on this particular salon, but I have strong thoughts, as I think all of us have. If you're thinking about the history of the Black Death, or if like I think Matt too, I've taught the history of the Black Death every so often, and there's always been kind of a temptation in the room with students to say, these stupid medieval people, they just didn't get it, right? It's a lot harder, I think, it's going to be a lot harder for 18-year-olds who have come through their entire high school shaped by the failures to stop the COVID pandemic, to react to the story of the Black Death in the same way. I don't know how they're going to react, and part of it is because we don't know the end of the story, right? We only know that in the US the Omicron variant is weakening. We don't know We don't know June. We don't know next fall. We don't know the Black Death, the second plague pandemic was a 300 or 400 year event, centuries of events. So I try to engage it with a lot of humility. I don't know if that was useful, but I think about this all the time, Anna. I'm right. I'm right in this frame of trying to be a good contemporary journalist with the humility of a historian.
I love this, and it also reminds me of the only thing that we, like every generation seems to want to be the pre of, is some kind of apocalypse. I know that one day somebody will be right. I know that, right? I recently reread The Name of the Rose, and all they talk about all the time is how the world is over and they are like the declining Greeks. And I'm like, guys, what are you talking about? Like, things are just beginning. Like, you've seen nothing yet. Like, you think this is science? Just wait. Yeah. But we do the same thing, right? And
that is my favorite piece of medieval fiction. Both, and I love the movie too. I mean, it is my absolute favorite piece of fiction about the Middle Ages. Is The Name of the Rose.
You should do another salon just on that book.
I will come and talk about The Name of the Rose for your salon
anytime.
Anytime.
But it's right there. I think it's like our complicated relationship with mortality, right? Because the only thing we're more scared of than dying is that we die and life goes on. Like, our friends recover and our spouse remarries, right? So we fantasize that, okay, if I have to die, let's all die at the same time. And it's more like a weird kind of hope.
It's a death drive, right? Kind of the.
No, it's more like if I have to die, like, let's do it all at the same time, and then I'm not missing out on any parties.
Yeah, but on the point out, there's that, but there's the flip side too, where the medievals, some of them talk about themselves as modern, right? I remember that being when I first was reading some of the school, like the scholastics. Or I guess it was what John Salisbury, I think he was talking of, like Bernard of Chartres, the quotation of, like, we're just dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants. Like, they had a sense of progression, and that they were moderns in the 12th century, in the 13th century, and very kind of consciously seeing themselves as moderns too, of we're achieving great new things and great new aspirations. So there's both in some of the writings, the sense of dread, and like, we're like, what is it, Joachim and Fiors, right? Or the, like, the apocalypse is here. How do we deal with this, right? Like, or why hasn't the second coming, happened yet? But on the flip side, there's also the sense of aspiration, and I mean, it's human, right? They're human, we're human, like both of these sides of the coin they're experiencing, which I guess I find fascinating. But we have another hand up, Laura.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Little turning point. One thing I really enjoyed about the book, I've recommended it to many people, but and I've kind of been arguing the same point for about 20 years with just friends. In it, I was particularly interested that they referenced, I believe it's Charles Haskin's 12th century Renaissance, which is one of the things that got me into medieval studies. When I was at Catholic University, I used to go up to the third floor of the library where all the dusty old books were, and found that one. And I was just wondering if maybe you had any other thoughts on the 12th century Renaissance and what it meant to the people of the time who came after, compared to what we call the Renaissance, the rediscovery of the classical text, which I think was a big part of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, so it's still a foundational text. Like, the 12th century, for people who study the European Middle Ages, still kind of has this outsized presence as a moment of this kind of world historical significance. And the thing is, like they're kind of right. I mean, like, you have kind of rapid urbanization, you have the aftermath, you have the kind of the birth of the crusading movement, like, in earnest, really, with after the fall of Jerusalem in 1099, so starting in 1100. You have the formation, or at least the centralization of monarchies in England, France, not so much in Germany, but in Iberia as well. So, like, all these kind of roots of modernity. The thing about Haskins, and the thing that he participated in, I think we talked about this a little bit though, is again this idea of Renaissance. I think just generally is really problematic, and it's paired with the idea of fall, right? Is that you want something kind of cyclical and like crests and troughs on a wave. And so what Haskins was trying to do was to rescue the Middle Ages from the 14th century Italian Renaissance by just pulling it back a little bit. And what happens almost immediately after that, like within 15 or 20 years, is people start to talk about the Etonian Renaissance, which is 2 centuries before the 12th century Renaissance in the 10th century, right? And then people start talking about the Carolingian Renaissance, which is in the 9th century. So again, like you're just kind of moving things a little bit back, but you're not changing the frame of the discussion. And so if you stand back and look at aggregate, like, well, maybe there are moments of great literary, cultural, artistic production and political transformations and warfare and things like that that are happening consistently. So the thing about like, and so I think that, you know, one of the things like John Kotz, who's at Whitman College, wrote a great book. You know, it's a little bit more kind of textbooky, but it's a great book kind of thinking about what he calls the long 12th century, which again, I love these ideas of kind of long centuries because it really breaks down again these kind of artificial barriers that we put on things. So if you're talking about the 12th century Renaissance, he's effectively arguing like you got to start like 200 years before then and talk about what's happening then, because all of those things bleed into what's going on. And you can't talk about the impact of the 12th century Renaissance without talking about things like the Black Death. Rapid urbanization means concentrations of population centers in ways that they hadn't been, which in a raging pandemic leads to higher spreads of disease. And also increased travel between those things because you need supplies of food, of artisanal products and things like that in order to supply the people who are living in those cities and things like that. So Haskins, again, is of this particular moment. What's fascinating too about Haskins, though, is, and I can't remember if we talk about this in the book, is like he was a narc, like he worked for the U.S. government, and so his ideas of state formation were basically modern political ideas in the aftermath of World War I, in the post-Versailles era, which were he was pulling back into the Middle Ages and just kind of saying that this is where the origins of them were. So like he was commissioned by the State Department, like he was an advisor to Wilson for a little bit, President Wilson for a little bit of time as well, like as a medieval historian. So like these things are all kind of intimately connected, and like we need to, that's why he's thinking about things the way they are. That's not, again, to say that things weren't happening in the 12th century Renaissance or in the 12th century generally, but putting that term on it, I think leads you down to some assumptions that we want to, as historians, kind of pull ourselves away from and examine the sources themselves, the period itself, on its own terms.
Laura, did you want to say more?
Oh no, that's just very interesting. Like
your hand is still up, so I didn't.
Sorry.
If you wanted to respond,
I'm
it was a great question.
I'm not a real good Zoomer, so I do things like that. But it is just interesting with all the different Renaissances. Actually supports your point that there is no great fall and recovery. It's a continuation of various ups and downs that are much smaller. And the 12th and 13th century is kind of my favorite era of history. So
I think it's really liberating as a historian when you step away from those narratives, because then you can say, okay, we're no longer stuck in this narrative. So what is happening? Oh, look, there's this intellectual life in Paris, and it's being funded in these ways, and then it's funded in that way, and then here's the politics, and then eventually we're at the University of Paris, and we start to see medieval universities, and we can do a different kind of analysis, but it's not like one day they woke up and started reading Greek. They were doing it the whole time, but there are these different kinds of funding and different and contested, and I mean, I just think it lets you do a more interesting story.
I want to pivot things a little bit and ask about nostalgia, because this is something that is an undercurrent in the book, and something I know you both write about as well, very much in relation to current events. And we've seen, even in the last, Ken saying yes, good question. We've seen, as Donald mentioned, references to things like calling for a Brutus, characterizations of the firefight happening as medieval, and also with the language around Russia's invasion of Ukraine, hearkening back to some medieval contestations over whose land is whose. But we also see that in American politics as well. We see that in the language in American politics and some American political movements, a lot of iconography around medievalism as well. And what's interesting to me something that you all focus on is sort of this idea of looking back at the past in a very utilitarian way. And I think my big question, again, for you and for all, is what are the uses of nostalgia? And is nostalgia ever actually a good thing when it comes to state formation, when it comes to cultural rallying points? Is there a healthy way to be nostalgic, or do we only see in history that that leads to a good for some and terrible for others sort of outcome? What are the examples and uses you've seen?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start, but I'd love to hear what other people had to say too, if anybody has anything. So if not, I can certainly fill the space. So
you start, Matt. You start.
Okay. So is there a healthy form of nostalgia? I mean, I don't think so. And because I think the problem comes from the premise of nostalgia itself, or kind of what's embedded in this idea of nostalgia is that you always need to be asking nostalgia for whom and to what end. So because what nostalgia tries to do, and I think of in some ways nostalgia and the study, like the writing of history, not the past, but history as kind of two ends of a spectrum, right? In which nostalgia wants to efface any sort of contingency. It wants to suggest that there is a rainbow connection, that you can move directly from whatever past you're talking about directly to the present without talking about kind of historical development or change over time or anything like that. And what history ultimately tries to do is to complicate every picture about the past. So to say that it could have been otherwise, you have to understand that there were dissenting voices at the time. You have to understand that the sources are a little bit problematic in these ways, and so you can't read them in this way. You have to look at other things from different perspectives and stuff like that. One great example that I can think of, for example, is like, I think my own take on this, and it's being recorded, so the entire world will know very soon, but the entire debate about the 1619 Project and kind of its place in the teaching of American history is fundamentally a debate about nostalgia versus history, right? In which people who, what the 1619 Project is ultimately doing is querying or questioning the way that US history is fundamentally understood and asking, who is this history for? Like, for a long time, like, certainly and arguably absolutely until today, it's been written for white men, and oftentimes for white landholding men throughout the majority of American history, right? It's only very slowly across time has the franchise democracy been expanded to start including things like women, to start including people who were not landholders, to start including people who were not white as well. What the kind of the reaction is oftentimes doing, I don't think necessarily consciously, but it's saying like, no, we need this story about the way that the reasons that America was founded, the way that it was founded, because we need to pull that past into our present. And if you challenge that connection, then everything else in between there starts to crumble. So there's a danger there from the people who are nostalgic about the American founding and who were worried about the 1619 Project, because it leads to questions about like, okay, what else in American history do we have to rethink? Historians would say, and have almost always said, like, yeah, everything you got to rethink. Like, you're constantly, like, the thing about history is that it's always people arguing with each other about things. Like the idea of revisionist history, like, that's just history. History is like you put David and I in a room, even though we wrote a book together, and ask us to talk about some medieval element, like, we're going to start arguing at some point about, the meaning of this, what sources we should be talking about, and ultimately, whether we should include that. We went through several iterations of that about just what do we include in our book, right? Like, we didn't agree, like, at times we had a vague sense, and like, he lost some things and I lost some things, and we came to an agreement, and hopefully we're not too bitter about that. Though I'm bringing it up right now, so maybe I am a little bit bitter. But anyway, so back to the thing. Like, again, like nostalgia, I think it's not like it's not bad in and of itself, but I think it just comes with assumptions. And I'll say one more thing, and I know I'm just kind of rambling now, is that because I teach about this a lot of times, I talk about nostalgia. The example I always give my students, the thing that they can seem to relate to, is Kraft macaroni and cheese. Kraft macaroni and cheese is perfect nostalgia, because most people have had that sometime in their life. If they're from the US, they have fond memories of it. They think it tastes really great. But the secret is it's terrible, right? It's really not good. And if you have it when you're an adult, like you eat it, and I've done this many times, like I get trapped in it again, like I have it and I eat it and it's just like, it's not that great. But what it's doing is it's triggering a memory of a moment, right? You're remembering your youth, you're remembering family, you're remembering like dinner, you're remembering some sort of special treat that you got to have as a kid, right? Or something like that. And so you're associating all these things with it, which isn't the reality of the past. It's one particular thing that you want to drag back into the present. And what historians have to do, jerks like me, do with these students is say like macaroni and cheese, Kraft macaroni and cheese is actually bad. You're not actually remembering what you think you're remembering. And I'm forcing you to kind of query those things. So I'm sorry. That's who I am.
Neil, I see.
I just want to jump in real quick and just say that I think that political nostalgia is always a destructive force. I cannot think of any situation which it is, or at least which contains the potential for destruction and othering and all of the worst things that we see in history within the context of politicized nostalgia. There may be personal nostalgia, that doesn't necessarily work that way. But when looking at it sort of from as a political tool, a tool for political storytelling, which is the kind of historian I think certainly that I am, but I think Matt too, in our scholarship as well. Like I in many ways as a scholar don't care what happened during the Fourth Crusade, although I have read very deeply and I think I know as much as anyone can, and I've even written, but I don't care. I'm interested in the ways in which the Fourth Crusade having happened that becomes a tool in storytelling and political identity formation. Like that's the thing that my book is about, and my scholarship's about. And so I just think nostalgia is one of the most destructive forces in human history, and I don't want to step away from that. I really think it is.
We've got a lot of hands up. Someone feel free to jump in.
Well, I would definitely, since it's pretty close to being the topic. Hi, I'm Neil. Obligatory fangirl moment for me as well. Really enjoyed or have enjoyed the book so far. And apologies, David, in particular, for spamming your Twitter timeline about camels, Vikings and camels.
Anytime.
Terrific. Glad to hear that. And I probably regret that. But I was going to ask, because Matthew just mentioned, if you could, what are some of the things that got left out of the book? I'm curious what, David and Matthew wanted to get in and what just he didn't have room for.
David should take this because I know he still holds a grudge about one of these things.
Let me kind of pull in Maria's question too about co-writing the book, because I think they kind of go together. And in part they go together because we wrote this book in a specific moment in time, and that moment had implications for how the book turned out. Which is to say, our original plan was that writing a book together seemed hard. We had written an op-ed together that we liked. I remember literally sitting on my pajamas on my couch with the TV on, doing edits with Matt to get it ready for submission. It was a seamless, easy process that I really enjoyed. But writing a book is on another tier. Matt, as he said at the beginning, texted me. We had a title. We started kicking around a draft. I flew to Virginia. We worked together. I drove over the mountains before dawn and dictated the first paragraphs of our first version of our first chapter into my phone, based on what we had done. And then we got to the proposal, and then there's the long period of contract negotiations in which we were neither of us really believed it was going to happen. So we didn't do a lot of writing in that summer of 2019 because it all seemed like someone's really going to pay us to write this book. That's amazing. It's going to collapse. It didn't collapse. Matt got on a plane. He flew to Minnesota. We wrote some chapters. We rented a cabin. We went fishing, and we thought, this is what we're going to do. We'll write individually, and then we'll get together and we'll meet somewhere. We'll go fishing. We'll make barbecue. We'll write more. This will be our process. We had a list of chapters. We were kicking around. And then the pandemic happened. So instead, we didn't see each other until I think the October or late September of last fall, when the book was done. It was put to bed. We couldn't change anything by that point. So there was a long period where we didn't see each other physically at all, and so we had to write remotely, and that really changed the nature of the book, and it changed the ways in which we wrote. So when it comes to leaving things out, our process was this: one of us would draft a chapter. And it would be more or less complete depending on how easy or hard it was for us to get it more or less complete. And then we'd send it to the other person, and the other person would write in a Google Doc, would literally write on top of it, which is to say no track changes, no commentary, no discussion, no, is it okay if I change this? They just made it theirs. And that process would continue until we had a draft that we felt good about. And then we'd start tracking changes for our own sake. But by that point, although there are individual sentences that I remember writing, and there are a lot of bad jokes that I know Matt wrote. The book is filled with bad jokes, and they're almost all Matt's fault. So I know that 99% of the sentences I have no idea, and I don't care who drafted first. And there are even some sentences that fill me with emotion, that I'm really proud that they exist under my name. And I don't know how they came to be. They are just our sentences.
You get nostalgia for them.
That's right. So in that process then, and the reason first of all, I think it's an interesting process because you don't get trained in grad school how to write together. You get trained in grad school how to write by yourself, right? In the profession, you get rewarded for single authored books and articles, even though people do, but there's sort of no practice there. So we had to make it up, and there's certainly no practice for how to do it in the middle of a pandemic, where you're sort of stuck at home and you don't have access to your libraries, and you don't, I wanted us to go to Ravenna, and at least in the epilogue to do that journalist trick of saying, on a sunny afternoon, Matt and I we walked into the mausoleum and sat there on the bench where maybe, there's kind of narrative tricks you can do as a writer that work because they locate the reader and the writer in the same place. So I don't mean tricks dismissively. I mean like rhetorical moves that have a function that work. It doesn't work as well saying, as I entered the 370th day of being isolated in my study without being access to my books, right? But that is true of what happened. So that was our process. And in that process, there are often these moments in which one of us would get kind of excited about a thing and we'd hand it over to the other person and the other person would write it out. And those are good decisions. The one that I love that I'm really frustrated about that we had to cut because Matt was right. I'm frustrated because he was right, was on this woman, Matilda of Tuscany. Matilda of Tuscany is one of the most interesting people in the history of the Middle Ages. She mostly by accident, of men and boys dying, rules Tuscany in the 11th century. She has some marriages, but no heirs. She's really responsible for turning Tuscany into a semi-independent power within the structure of the Holy Roman Empire. She is responsible in some ways for the city of Florence becoming a major urban center, which is why she showed up in our text, because it was in the Dante chapter. And the point of the Dante chapter is Dante and not Matilda of Tuscany, which is why we ended up cutting her. But also she's a great example of the ways in which, one of the things about our book is we talk about women a lot. And that's because, at least as far as we can tell, half the people in the Middle Ages were probably women. They were there, but they're also there in the sources. It's not like we had to work to do it. So there's the great story of Canossa, where the Pope and the Emperor meet, and the Emperor is barefoot in the snow and objects himself before Pope Gregory VII. And it's a big political moment in the history of the Middle Ages about these two men. It's happening at Matilda's castle. And it's very clear that Matilda is the architect of the event, of this incredibly famous dramatic event. And almost never, that story is almost never told with her in it in any particular kind of way. So that's a good example of the kind of thing. But in general, I know I'm running on just a little bit, but in general, throughout the process, we did not want to write a textbook. And there are great textbooks. There are great textbooks about the European Middle Ages. We didn't want to write the textbook for a couple of reasons. One is they tend to be expensive. So we weren't doing that, although we hope it is used in classes all the time. But also because the work of a textbook is coverage. To the extent possible within the framework of the project, a textbook should try to say everything it can. It should cover all the regions, all the places. We're trying to make an argument and everything in the book, or a series of connected arguments. And so for us, did we talk about one spot or another was not the rubric by which we wanted to make decisions. We wanted to make decisions about arguments. And so, and also coverage is impossible, right? The book's 300 pages long, which is pretty short. We could have written a 600-page book or even a 900-page book. In fact, there's a whole market for really, really long popular history books. It's a big market. They cost $40 and you give them to your dad for Christmas. It's a really good commercial market for people like us. But 900 pages would not cover all the things in the Middle Ages or all the places or all the times. 1,000,000 pages would not. So instead, we tried to always prioritize what are the arguments we're making? How does this chapter fit into that bigger argument? And then it becomes a lot less painful to leave things out because it's about the thesis instead of the coverage.
Thank
The
you.
framing becomes the bright ages. Maria, did you have a question? Oh, no. Okay. Something that Donald and I were chatting about before the salon was thinking about how Americans get usage out of medieval history, and whether Americans or Europeans tend to draw more on medieval history these days and why. Kind of I think our question there was noting a little bit of the resurgence in interest for medieval myth, medieval storytelling, medieval iconography, certainly in the US, but then thinking about popular literature, everything from science fiction, things like Dune and Foundation, to things like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, being works that were very much either based on medieval myth or were based on Gibbon's view of Rome, and it's sort of these different empire influences. So I'm curious, what do we get out of being so interested or so invested in medieval history right now, and what are some of the things you all are seeing that are sort of the uses that we're applying?
I can start here. I wish I knew, right? Because then I would be able to sell 1 million more books because I'd be able to tap into it. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things so even, in the time that I've been in the profession, like since graduate school, basically, and then I've been here at Virginia Tech for the last 15 or 16 years, is that there's little boomlets, right? Like little things, like especially around Game of Thrones, that was really popular. Way back when the Da Vinci Code, there was a surge in interest in medieval topics and things like that. But there seems to be something more kind of in the water, if you will, like across Europe and the United States in this interest in this particular period. Some of it is particularly nefarious, and I think it has a lot to do with the interconnections of the global far right. So stuff that had actually probably been going on for a while, but just hadn't got a lot of people's attention or thought was more marginal within larger topics. I'm thinking, for example, about the 2011 massacre that occurred in Norway by Anders Breivik, in which he justified his attack on the leftist party in power there by claiming he was part of a new Knights Templar movement. And then following almost immediately after that was a Syrian refugee crisis, in which you had a lot of people from the Middle East coming into Europe. And so the far right rallied around this idea of crusading. You had people, there's pictures of people in Hungary and in Germany and in the UK who were dressed up, like cosplaying as crusaders at these anti-immigrant rallies. And then, because everything is connected through the internet, and I think there's been some research by scholars like people like J.J. McNabb and not Mark Letney, I can't remember his last name right now, Pikovich, people at the SPLC and stuff like that, about like Russian disinformation campaigns were feeding far right things and were fueling this idea of kind of crusade nostalgia among the global far right, as again a moment with Rainbow Connection when Europe defended itself against an Islamic invader. And so this is what was happening then. That's what was that's what was happening then. This is what is happening now. We can draw some sort of connection. It became kind of mainstreamed as well too. And then this is again just kind of at the far right with terrorist attacks that occurred subsequently, one-off events like the Bataclan in Paris, the London Bridge terror accounts, one of my first pieces of public-facing scholarship, a piece in the Washington Post I published in 2017 after the London Bridge attack, in which you had U.S. congressmen, people across the right-wing media spectrum in the United States calling for another crusade. Basically, this is the only way we will stop ISIS at the time from invading us or from destroying our way of life. So I think that's been pushing a lot of this narrative, but I don't want to minimize the pop culture aspect of this as well. Like, I think even though Game of Thrones is a fantasy medieval element, obviously drawing on things like the success of Tolkien, not too long before then, things like History Channel's The Vikings show as well, like just kind of brought this period into the popular consciousness in a way that I think it hadn't been before. Especially with streaming services, like everybody can watch the same thing. Like, especially Game of Thrones was like a weird phenomenon in which it seemed like literally everyone was watching the same thing at the same time and talking about it. And it was medievally stuff. And it led to some really weird debates among medievalists about like, oh, this is real medieval, that's not real medieval. Like, what does it mean? Like, do we talk about Game of Thrones? Should we not talk about Game of Thrones? Kind of whatever. But again, like, so I think we're dealing with a little bit with the aftermath of that, the consequences of that, in which the medieval is part of our world now, at least as Americans who consume media, both about politics and about culture. And so I hope, for the future of medieval studies, it doesn't go away, but I hope that there are better things, like hopefully our book and other things that people can consume rather than getting stuff off just some random search on the internet or, subreddits that are totally terrible or something like that.
And, I do think there's something interesting about the ways in which North Americans versus Europeans engage the history of the European Middle Ages, right? I mean, I think that there's something interesting about people doing history that is geographically connected to where they imagine themselves to be from, or are, I'm using imagine in kind of a, not the right way, where they as they understand themselves to be from, versus people who are doing the historical work in a place that they understand themselves to not be from. And I think that's, I do think there are some differences there. And there, on the academic side, the differences can be just really very, mundane, like, do you have access to the sources 5 days a week, or do you have to get a grant and rent an apartment to get access to the sources? There's a Venetian historian at he's actually at Western Michigan, but who has a house in Venice. His father's a professor at the University in Venice. His Italian is much better than mine, as you might expect, because he's Italian, and his Latin is better than mine too, because he probably started studying at age 5. And certainly throughout his career before he came to Michigan, he lived down the street from, or the canal from the sources. So his work is just locked in the sources, just source after source after source. And it would take me 10 years to do that work. And I would have to live there those 10 years. And so, we ask very different kinds of questions, and we imagine our projects very differently. And I don't think he particularly likes my work, which is fine. And I think his work sometimes could dream a little, could soar a little, instead of just being, and then there's this source and this source and this source and this source. And part of that is because we just have a different relationship to our information, as well as, but we also have different national stories, the ways in which residents of the United States of America over centuries have talked about their connection to the European Middle Ages is different in its imagination and its aspiration and its reach than people who are living, in the UK, in England, talk about the medieval history of England. I'm not sure either of them is more true, right? That this is not about truth, but this is about the ways in which narratives are being said. And it's not especially new. Matt organized this wonderful conference at Virginia Tech. Matt and I spent a lot of time together, and at least we're fans of each other's work. And I think this conference of Matt's was one of the examples of why I'm fans of his work. He organized this conference in which he brought historians of the Crusades and historians of the Civil War, the US Civil War, together to talk about nostalgia, to talk about these kinds of things. And, both during and after the Civil War in the American South, there's a lot of kind of pro-slavery, Reconstruction narrative of people, the KKK comparing themselves to the Knights Templar. But there's also, there's this wonderful book called The Black Middle Ages by Matthew Vernon, which is, Matt, see, we're on the same page. Matt went and got it. Which is about like the medieval writing of W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote about the Middle Ages and set fantasy stories in the Middle Ages, which was totally new to me until Matt Vernon wrote this book. So this is, in some ways, the Middle Ages is having a moment in the 21st century in North America. And it does come and go. In some ways, it's been part of the cultural landscape just in the United States of America for a long, long time.
So I know we've covered a lot of ground in the last few minutes. So did anyone have, Anna, I think you had a question maybe from part of the previous conversation.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to something that Matthew, you were talking about, being to play the Eastern European card again. Like I grew up in the narrative of being between the two empires and the Arpad House, the Renaissance of the Arpad House flags after 1990, and other resurrection of medieval imagery. But first of all, Game of Thrones. Like we sometimes joke at these salons that because of how American culture is developing into new directions in the past years, if you want to put on a TV show where you show how people actually are, that they are, that they indulge in intrigues and don't necessarily treat each other with utmost respect at all times, you have to put dragons into it. Because the people are like, okay, this can go on TV. If this was actually like guys in suits, never. Or then it would have to be like outrageous comedy or something. I always say, like, I do History of War series, History of Love. We go through thousands of years of texts and ideas. And I'd like to say that we're obsessed with the Middle Ages because we are deep inside a world based on really old religious orders. And we are obsessed in Europe with the Middle Ages because this is where we originate our current religious civilization. But to kind of contradict myself and share my two opposing opinions at the same time about this, I remember the Syrian refugee crisis, but right now with the Ukraine crisis, it's the same narrative, even though it has nothing to do with the Muslim faith, right? So we use the same, hordes breaking in from the East narrative on completely European Russians. And they are, invoking the same fears. As somebody who has studied extensively the Second World War, when suddenly that became not enough, because, for instance, the Russians had arrived into Berlin, there were other layers added to that, and suddenly it became a racial thing, and they pretended that all the Russian soldiers somehow came from the Caucasus, for instance, like things where we don't actually find historical proof that this was the case. It was kind of to some degree a fantasy. So that always this fear of the East, I think, is somehow, to contradict myself, is beyond religion. But I don't know how to, I don't fully understand our own narratives about it or what makes them so powerful.
Shall I go first, Matt?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. There's a couple of different things. There's I actually thought it was just recent, but it's from 2018. I think there's a Wall Street Journal sort of cover article about Putin showing him in Mongol dress, trying to talk about him as Mongol. I could find the cover in a minute, or someone else can. But it sort of goes to your point. We are in medieval studies, I think, an incredibly exciting but contested, as one might expect, moment in thinking about these questions from the Middle Ages, thinking about what Geraldine Hung, who wrote a really important book called The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages, I think that's what it's called, would call race making, and the ways in which they're tangled up in ideas about difference from religion, but also then how, when and where that starts to be perceptions of kind of phenotypical differences in faces and skin color, right? Like, and that these are tangled. The ways in which, and Hung's book, which Matt just linked to, is just really one of a broad variety of people doing this kind of work, and then also people responding to it and responding to the responding. But I would encourage us from the medieval perspective to adopt this lens of race making, right? And then to what extent it applies in the 21st century, I mean, it's really complicated, and there are people who have a lot more expertise in that, but I certainly see that in the discourses and the discourses around difference, in which, you know, so I'm Jewish, and my relationship to Judaism has changed radically over my lifetime. I grew up in Tennessee, in which being Jewish was something in which people would say, well, David, that's really too bad. You're going to go to hell. You know, I'm so sorry to hear that, my friend, you know, lovingly, and then maybe trying to convert me so I could be, you know, properly become a good Baptist or Methodist, right? To then in my 20s and 30s, really not thinking about my Judaism at all. And then in this era of the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence, and anti-Semitic discourse, which has always been there, but has become intensified and mainstreamed in the American right. You know, I would say that Trump was an incredibly anti-Semitic president and said many, many extremely anti-Semitic things. And of course, we also had just incredible rise of violence against Jews, including the Tree of Life massacre. I mean, that first part is a matter of interpretation, I guess, though I think I'm right. But that second part is not. I mean, the numbers are the numbers in terms of the violence. I've never felt more Jewish, and I don't really enjoy it. So that's kind of a preamble to think about the ways in which Jews in the Middle Ages and beyond operate in and out of these different categories, depending on what's useful both to Jews and to non-Jews in terms of race and religion, and race and religion at the same time. And I think we could tell similar stories about Muslims and different narratives, sort of Muslims from, you know, from different parts of the world. And so I mean, so again, you know, race making is a way to look at othering and also self-identification, and then the implications of that as they play out in different historical moments, including our own, I think is really useful. I was just reminded of a Bulgarian student I had who she was brilliant, but had lived most of her life in Bulgaria and had really adopted kind of the Bulgarian national narrative. This was in the I guess the late aughts or the early 2010s. And she came to me and said, David, I want to do my senior paper, and I want to write on how all the problems in Bulgaria today are the fault of the Ottomans, on the fault of the Turks, that Bulgaria, all the problems are the fault of the Turks. And I want to write that history. And I said, okay, you can write that history. Tell me what your sources are going to be. And she came with sources, and, you know, we started to do it. And then about a month later, she came to me and said, David, I have a problem. Or she probably said, Professor Perry. But David, I have a problem. I don't think I'm right. I think that this is just an argument that you know, that the modern politicians in Bulgaria are blaming everything on the Turks instead of blaming it on themselves or identifying the complexity. And she said, am I allowed to write the different argument? And I said, you're allowed to write whatever the sources tell you. That was a really good day, because as a teacher, you don't have that many really good days of that. So I remember that day really clearly. You know, these are the kinds of things that history should be doing, right? That we should be identifying these arguments and then untangling them and seeing the complexities of identity and nostalgia and narrative and nationalism and difference and race and religion, and trying to figure out who is doing what kind of work and why and how. I've silenced you.
No, I like that. And this brings me up to a thought, something that we talked about preparing for the salon, and I've wondered for a while. And I think you do a great job in the book of painting the vividness and the kind of to use a modern term, the multiculturalism of it, of the different streams coming in, the flow of movements of people, of ideas, of goods and such. That even during this period, there is, right, Christianity is new to a lot of places during this period. They're having to deal with the prior customs, prior religions, fitting those into Christianity kind of identity. What are, I guess, good examples of how they were able to kind of harmonize different identities? And also a fun question of, if you had to make your own better version of Game of Thrones that showed off like the good aspects of the Middle Ages, what would that look like? Would it be like in like Andalusia? Would it be, you know, like what would that TV series look like, I guess, or what would that sort of movie, you know, series look like? So
well, I'll start with the harmonizing thing, and then I'll let David pitch a couple of TV ideas for you. So we have our.
You never know when a Hollywood producer's in the room, so
that's right. That's right.
Exactly.
I mean, there's an easy way to answer that, and then a more difficult way to answer that. And I don't know which one this is, but Christianity adapted, and Christianity does adapt to whatever culture it encounters. And so, you know, it struggles sometimes to harmonize itself with local practices. And there are certain things it insists upon, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes monotheism. I know that might be a weird thing to say, but as far as kind of practices go, there's a lot of flexibility, certainly throughout at least the early Middle Ages until the 12th and 13th century, about like how those kinds of things happen. Mostly because no one cares about the peasants. Like no one almost ever cares about the peasants throughout most of the Middle Ages. So what we're talking about oftentimes is when conversion happens, for example, like in England or in Gaul in the, you know, the 4th and 5th centuries, or even to some extent, like in the Americas in the 16th century, is missionaries target the elites of civilization. They get them to agree to usually some sort of fidelity, and at least some sort of statement of association about related to a belief system, allow their missionaries, the priests themselves, to set up churches. But after that, like, they don't super care. And then the authorities back wherever they were, the local bishops, the papacy back in Rome, or kind of whatever, the kings or things like that, they don't really care what kind of happens. And the reason that I can say this is because it's very clear in the wake of the Fourth Lateran Council, which occurs in 1215. There's a mandate in a way that hadn't happened before for bishops and especially university-educated churchmen to go out into the local parishes, the individual churches, and see what's going on and make sure there's no heresy, make sure there's no deviations. And so they actually start to do this, and they start to find all sorts of weird, to their mind, kind of weird practices. So they find like married priests, which they're not supposed to have. They start to find local religious practices, like we talk about, like the worship of a dog as a saint, Saint Guinefort, the Holy Greyhound, which was famously written about a book, and then we talk a little bit about as well. What becomes abundantly clear if you look at these in totality, or even if you look at the sources themselves, even the bishops' records of their travels, and they kept meticulous records oftentimes of their travels, is this stuff had been going on for centuries, like sometimes even for longer than that. And that was just what Christianity was in that region. And nobody seemed to care until this highfalutin churchman came into town and told them they were doing it wrong. And they very understandably said, like, what do you mean this is what we've been doing. This is what you told us was Christianity for 1,000 years. And now you're telling us it's not. And so that's where you see, and there's been some really compelling scholarship about this, that's where you see really, I think, a lot of the accusations of heresy, of deviant Christianity that seem to permeate the later Middle Ages. It's not a crisis of the Christianity itself, it's a crisis of elite and popular culture coming into contact and coming into conflict in a way that they hadn't before. Christianity itself, like, isn't necessarily like a thing, because I think that there are, if you look at it from a historian's perspective, especially as we try to do across 1,000 years, across a continent and several continents and more, is you really see multiple Christianities. like there's a veneer of universality, but it's really the practice, the experience of it, what scholars of religion call lived religion nowadays, is varies really varies very widely. And this is true kind of even into the modern day, but we won't go into that. So anyway, I'll turn it over to David for TV stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Matt keeps talking about the Carolingian Civil War as Game of Thrones, but grounded in history in terms of having multiple, a 3 or even 15 part conflict over power. It does not end up with it does not have any zombies or dragons in it, though we could always add some.
There are witches.
There are witches for sure. The story that I mean, there's just so many. The Middle Ages are filled with stories that haven't been dramatized or haven't been dramatized in major ways, and some of them would do different kinds of work. I mean, you talked to our Spain chapter. Hopefully, complicates the notion of convivencia, which is pretty. I mean, the scholarship's really taken that apart. At the same time, like, it wasn't happy multiculturalism, but at the same time, there were lots of moments in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and different kinds of Jews and different kinds of Christians, different kinds of Muslims, based on theology or language groups or things we might call ethnicities or wherever, lived together and were not killing each other, even though they were certainly not practicing modern multiculturalism, right? Like, we talk about the translation of the Quran into Latin, which is this amazing moment. It's done in order to refute the Quran. So it's not done out of a let's learn about the other in a modern kind of way. On the other hand, they were learning about the other as a result of translating the Quran. Like, that actually did happen. So it's messy. The story that I really want to tell is the Roman de Silence, which is the romance of silence. It's not a history story. It's a romance, but it's a romance about a girl raised as a boy who then goes to the court of the king, and the queen falls in love with her because she's so beautiful, and she rejects the queen, and the queen then says she tried to rape me, and then the king has her banished to go. Like, the king sends, I'm condensing, sends her out to go find Merlin, because that's an impossible task because no man can defeat Merlin. But she says, aha, in a Tolkien moment, I am no man. And she brings Merlin back to court, and Merlin laughs, and the queen's perfidy is revealed. And then, because it's medieval, the queen is then brutally executed, and Silence takes off her armor and puts on the dress and marries the king. So I've spoiled the ending for you. There are people doing just spectacular work around, like, thinking about it as a queer story, thinking about it as a trans story, because there is no medieval, it's not going to be a one-to-one kind of, it's not going to be the same as modern identity, but, is this a space in which you can imagine what it would look like to think about a space for a trans man in medieval society? I mean, it's this beautiful, complex text centered around gender and sexuality, and it also has the big "I am no man" reveal, and it has sword fights. And you could, if you have Merlin, you could add dragons if you want to. And so that's the $200 million. And I don't want to do it for cheap, though. I want $200 million budget. So if any of you happen to secretly be, working for Apple TV or Prime, please let me know, and I've got script writers standing by. I'm ready to go on it tomorrow.
We'll work on crowdsourcing that.
Yeah, just let me know. $200 million, though. I'm not doing it for 180. 200. That's my budget.
Okay.
For season one.
You gotta have standards, David. Yeah.
Let's see. I know that we have a hard deadline here in a few minutes.
Yeah, I just have to go pick up my daughter from Science Olympiad, and that's parenting. So. She built a trebuchet. She was first in the region for trebuchet. This is state. I kind of hope she comes in second, because then she'll be really happy, but she won't have to go to nationals. But that's just between us. That's just between us.
Is there a national trebuchet building competition?
There is. You build a small trebuchet, and you have to launch a tennis ball into a bucket. That's the contest. And you have to do charts and graphs because it's science. Anyway, I'm all in favor of it, but it would kind of be better if she only came in second. That would be good.
Good thing we're not recording this.
So. Yeah, I know.
We can edit. So we are, yeah, go ahead, Nadal.
No, I was gonna say, yeah, we're approaching the end here. I guess start to wrap up. I lost my train of thought there, Catherine. If you want to continue.
I was just going to ask if there are any last questions for Matthew and David, or any last thoughts on. I mean, we've covered as broad of a ground as we were hoping we would cover. There's so much there's just so many angles to take. So, any last thoughts or questions?
Any other fictional novels, books, TV shows that they enjoyed and like to recommend?
No, let Matt take it. I've Name of the Rose.
Name of the Rose. I have not.
Go back, and if you
We'll do
haven't
a
watched,
Swan. We'll do a Name of the Rose.
if you haven't
Swan.
watched the movie, go watch the movie. It's great.
So my favorite, most recent novel is Ishiguro's The Buried Giant. And I know there's some like division about that, but I think it's just talking about nostalgia and the medieval period. It ties into the Arthur legend. It's a gorgeous novel. I was weeping at the end of it. So.
A movie recently that I loved, and Brian knows this because I talked his ear off about it, but was the adaptation of The Green Knight. It's a retelling of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, starring Dev Patel, which in itself was a controversial choice for some, but I think an important one. And it's a brilliant reimagining of the tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And it sort of attempts to speak more to our cultural currents today. And I'm not totally sure it's successful, but it's weird enough that it will make you engage with it. It sort of forces you to engage with its weirdness. And it happens to be cinematically stunning. So I highly recommend.
It's not even like that much of a reimagining, because Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the poem is like super, super weird.
It's a
very
weird
open-ended.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Have you guys seen The Last Duel?
David has.
Yeah.
Should I devote 3 hours of my life to watching
No.
it?
It is an interesting film. It does some interesting things cinematically. There's nothing enjoyable about it because it's about a rape that is shown multiple times. It is. It's interesting that it was made. I did write about it with an expert in medieval gender and justice for Slate. We wrote 2 pieces, one very seriously about the ways in which it does not, in fact, replicate how rape was adjudicated in 14th century France, which, it's fine to take an event from 14th century France and make it about, modern issues around sexual violence. But in fact, how rape was adjudicated in 14th century France is important and interesting and worth knowing about. And I'm really just again, between us, thank goodness it's not recorded. No, it's fine. I'm the writer here, right? So I'm a medievalist and a writer, and Sarah is the world expert, or a world expert in this particular topic. So it was really a privilege to work for her. And then Slate asked us to write about Matt Damon's hair, which was a mullet. And in fact, we found a 12th century Norman chronicler who was really grumpy about these courtiers who had thief in the front and harlot in the back. So mullets are authentic, as are the criticism of them from uppity medieval monks. So it was they were fun. They were fun to write. It was not fun to watch the movie, but it is, as a medievalist, it's interesting. And so
that is an amazing anecdote to close on. Thank you.
Yeah. Thief in the back, harlot in the thief in the front, harlot in the back. It's been such a pleasure. I'm going to go pick up my kids.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone so much.
Thank you, David. And thank you all so much for joining. This was as wonderful and robust a conversation as we were hoping for. So.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you. That was incredible.
Catherine and other hosts.
Thank you all.
And hosts.
See everyone on Twitter.
It's nice chatting with you all.